All right, in this next section of the Chapter 37 video, we're going to finish up the continent of Africa with South Africa, which has a very different story than the previous places we've discussed, and then we will also be moving into the Middle East and looking at their post-World War II challenges. So, South Africa. South Africa actually became independent in 1964 completely, but prior to that, they had instituted the system of apartheid with the Afrikaners and the English in charge. And apartheid is based on a brutal system of racism that the Afrikaners, who were Dutch settlers from way back, were implementing based on biblical interpretation. And there was a lot of sympathy for the Afrikaners from the English because of their treatment in the Boer War and their placement on reservation systems and the killing of women and children. And so the English were very hesitant to, correct them. So anyways, when they took charge, which was actually in the 1940s, 44, I believe, before independence, the system of apartheid was put into place. So it was actually put into place prior to independence. Under the system of apartheid, no black Africans who were out of the population of South Africa at the time, there were 4.5 million whites, so English and Afrikaners, and there were 23 million black Africans. And then there were 3.5 people of mixed heritage, 3.5 million, people of mixed heritage, or people from South Asia who had migrated to South Africa as laborers. So none of these people were allowed to vote, black Africans or South Asians. And then the black Africans and South Asians were put into separate governing districts called homelands. And homelands had homelands were built on the worst land, the most remote land, and from the map you can see where those homelands are. You can also see the concentration of people. So these homelands were built so that the people in them had to be dependent on work outside, basically, of the homelands that they wanted to exist or survive. Black areas have no other racial groups as high as 30%, and homelands are traditional areas set aside by the South African government for specific black ethnic groups. So that sounds good, but it was really actually very bad for these people economically, because they were in these very remote locations where they were forced to work outside of their homelands. This is the tradition of mining in these areas is partially caused by, and the migrant workers that go to these mines is partially caused by this. Remember last time we talked about the frequent occurrence of HIV and AIDS in South Africa, and part of that is because of these migrant workers, and we'll talk more about that in class. If you did decide to vote or join a political party like the African National Congress, become important in a little bit, you would be put in jail. We're going to spend just a little bit of time learning about Nelson Mandela, since he becomes the first black African president of South Africa. Nelson Mandela was a lawyer, and he joined the African National Congress right before it became illegal in 1944, and he worked in law, like litigating people's cases who were African, Black Africans. Um, he was put in jail for his political activism for 27 years and was released by F.W. de Klerk in 1990. This anti-apartheid movement, excuse me, that Nelson Mandela was a big part of, lasted for a really long time into the 1990s. And one of the reasons it lasted for such a long time was because many countries in the West were very hesitant to disciplines or reprimand South Africa because of their Cold War stance. They were friends with the West, so they didn't want to they didn't want to come down too hard on them because they were their allies, which it seems ridiculous now. So apartheid ends up lasting until 1994. So here's a good example. You have this in 3 languages: English, Afrikaans, and then an indigenous language. All right. So the ending of apartheid began with an international boycott and pressure in the 1980s. And this led to reforms that were led by a Afrikaners president, F.W. de Klerk. And in 1994, the first elections were held where Black Africans could vote. And of course, the ANC won in a landslide, and Nelson Mandela became the first president, and he served as president in South Africa from 1994 to 1999. But this victory did not end the huge disparities that existed in South Africa between Black Africans and whites. And as part of this, an attempt was made through Truth and Reconciliation committees, which were basically chances for people to air their grievances without like jail time attached to them for the most part, just to get some of this out there. And the reason this was important was because there was so much hatred between these different groups. But even though they had, these Truth and Reconciliation committees, and there's attempts to make things more equitable, there's still a very difficult path for South Africa moving forward. And there's huge economic disparities. And as an example of that, here is a slum. What else do you call this? African area of a white town. You can see, these are places without any kind of resources, and so the poverty is still really immense. Here's Nelson Mandela with President Clinton, so you get an idea of the time period. And this is a British bus advocating for the boycott in 1989. I think we're going to stop there and we'll move into the Middle East in the next part of the presentation.